Have you ever wondered what it truly means to protect someone you love? Meet Charlotte, a dedicated teacher whose heart ached for a young boy named Brian. His small, trembling voice pleaded with her not to let him go home, sparking an urgent concern in her heart. She knew something wasn't right, and from that moment, her life took a turn she never expected. With determination, compassion, and the help of her husband Jason, Charlotte embarked on a journey to uncover the truth behind Brian's troubled life. What started as a normal day quickly spiraled into a mission to save a young boy from a world of fear and uncertainty. As the story unfolds, it transitions from moments of deep concern to inspiring acts of kindness, and finally, to a heartwarming resolution where love and family triumph over darkness. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. The young boy pleaded desperately, his voice trembling, as he begged not to go home with his uncle. His small hands clutched the edge of his desk, his eyes wide with fear. Alarm bells rang in the teacher's mind, a deep sense of unease settling in her chest. Something wasn't right. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the uncle drag the boy out of the classroom. Unable to shake the gnawing suspicion in her gut, she made the decision to follow them discreetly, hoping her instincts were wrong. Charlotte carefully locked the classroom door behind her, the soft click echoing in the empty hallway. She let out a weary sigh, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. Another day completed, she whispered to herself, a mixture of pride and exhaustion swirling within her. Teaching preschool was no easy task. It was a whirlwind of emotions, challenges, and tiny victories. Ever since childhood, she had dreamed of becoming a teacher, but the reality was often more overwhelming than she had imagined. As she made her way through the quiet school corridors, her thoughts wandered back to the children. Had they enjoyed the story she read aloud earlier? Did it spark their imaginations as much as she had hoped? She mentally noted that she needed to find more engaging books, stories that would light up their little faces with wonder. Reaching her car, Charlotte followed the familiar path she had walked for 6 long years since she began her journey at Sunshine School. The day had drained her, but she looked forward to the small comfort awaiting her at home. When she finally stepped through the front door, the warm aroma of her favorite stew filled the air. Her husband, Jason, had already prepared dinner, despite still being at work. A soft smile spread across her lips as she thought, "He always knows just what I need." Jason had a way of making even the most exhausting days feel a little lighter with his thoughtful gestures. Though Jason wasn't a renowned chef by any means, his passion for cooking was undeniable. Every meal he prepared was an act of love, a quiet but powerful way of caring for her. He knew that after a long day surrounded by the chaos of young children, Charlotte needed a moment of peace, and he provided that through the dishes he crafted with such devotion. Their schedules often clashed. Charlotte's days spent in the classroom, and Jason's nights working at the restaurant, but they both held on to the dream of a bigger house and a child to fill it with laughter. As she sat at the kitchen table, savoring the comforting stew Jason had left for her, her mind wandered to her students. How can I make math more fun for them, she pondered, the wheels of her mind already turning. Maybe I can incorporate more games. They love games. After dinner, she settled down to grade the day's assignments. Opening the students' activity books, she made thoughtful notes on their progress. Timothy is really improving with his writing, but Anna still struggles with her numbers. She mused, marking each page with bright stars and encouraging words. She could picture their faces lighting up when they saw the positive feedback, and that alone made the long hours worth it. But as the evening wore on, exhaustion finally claimed her. The day's demands had drained her energy, and though she usually waited up for Jason, tonight she simply couldn't. Glancing at the clock, she realized it would be hours before he returned. With a heavy heart and tired eyes, Charlotte decided to call it a night. She left a small note for Jason on the kitchen counter, a quiet reminder of their love, before retreating to bed, letting sleep take her. The following morning, Charlotte arrived at Sunshine School with a fresh sense of purpose, ready to embrace another day filled with the joys and challenges of teaching. As she stepped into her classroom, she could feel the excitement bubbling within her, eager to share new songs and lessons with her young students. The room was already buzzing with the cheerful energy of children, their laughter echoing in the air as they settled into their morning routine. In the middle of leading the class through a new song, a soft knock at the door interrupted her. Turning around, she saw Dr. Michael Brown, the school principal, standing at the doorway with a small boy by his side. His expression was gentle yet serious, and the boy next to him looked down at the floor, avoiding eye contact. "Charlotte, could I have a word with you?" Dr. Brown asked, his voice calm but carrying a hint of urgency. With a nod, Charlotte followed him to the principal's office, where the boy stood quietly by the desk. Dr. Brown introduced him with a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Charlotte, this is Brian. He'll be joining your class starting today." Brian, dressed in simple, worn clothes, barely glanced up. His shy demeanor tugged at Charlotte's heartstrings as she noticed how nervous he seemed. Crouching down to meet Brian at eye level, Charlotte smiled warmly, hoping to ease his anxiety. "Welcome to our class, Brian." "I'm so happy to have you here," she said softly, trying to make him feel safe and accepted. But Brian only nodded slightly, still too timid to respond. The principal gave Charlotte a grateful smile and asked her to take Brian to the classroom and introduce him to the other children. "Of course, Dr. Brown," Charlotte replied, extending her hand to Brian with a gentle smile. "Come on, Brian. Let's meet your new classmates." Brian hesitated for a moment, but then followed her, his small hand barely gripping hers. As they entered the classroom, the other children's eyes widened with curiosity. Charlotte could feel the anticipation in the room. "Class, we have a new friend joining us today," she announced with enthusiasm, gently encouraging Brian to step forward. "This is Brian. Let's all make him feel welcome," the children responded in unison, their voices echoing a cheerful "Hello, Brian." Brian, still overwhelmed by the new environment, offered a shy wave in return, his eyes scanning the room nervously. As the day progressed, Charlotte made sure to involve Brian in the class activities, carefully guiding him through each task. She moved around the room, observing the students as they worked, when something caught her eye. Brian's notebook lay open on his desk, its pages worn and tattered, with only a few blank sheets left. Concern washed over her as she gently approached him. "Brian," she asked softly, kneeling beside him, "don't you have a new notebook for the school year?" Brian looked up at her, and for the first time their eyes truly met. His brown eyes held a quiet sadness that made Charlotte's heart ache. "This is all I have, teacher," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The vulnerability in his words stirred something deep within Charlotte. She knew how crucial it was for children to have the right materials to succeed in school, and she couldn't bear the thought of Brian struggling without them. Without a second thought, Charlotte walked over to her locker and retrieved a brand new notebook, still wrapped in its protective cover. She returned to Brian's desk and gently placed it in front of him. "Here, Brian. You can use this," she said, her voice full of warmth and encouragement. Brian stared at the notebook, his eyes widening with surprise. For a brief moment, the sadness lifted, replaced by a small glimmer of gratitude. "Thank you, teacher," he murmured, his voice soft but sincere. Charlotte smiled at him, her heart swelling with a mix of compassion and hope. It was a small gesture, but she knew it meant the world to Brian. And in that moment, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, one that reminded her why she had become a teacher in the first place. As recess unfolded, Charlotte stood near the yard, her eyes instinctively searching for Brian among the clusters of laughing, playing children. She found him sitting alone by the edge of the playground, far from the vibrant energy that filled the space. His small fingers gripped a piece of chalk, tracing quiet drawings on the concrete ground. The sight tugged at her heart, a growing concern settling deep in her chest. She couldn't ignore it. Something about Brian's isolation felt different. She turned to Anna, another teacher who was overseeing the children. "I'm worried about Brian," Charlotte said softly, her gaze still fixed on the solitary boy. "He's always by himself, and I haven't seen him try to play with the others." Anna followed Charlotte's gaze and shrugged gently. "It's normal, Charlotte. He just arrived. Kids need time to warm up to new classmates, especially if they're a bit shy. Give it some time." Charlotte nodded, but her worry remained. She watched as Brian quietly continued drawing, his expression distant and disconnected from the playful noise around him. "Maybe I should try to help him feel more included," she thought, determined to find a way to break through his shell. When recess ended, Charlotte guided the children back inside, ensuring they organized their belongings and prepared for the next lesson. She noticed that Brian was the last to rise, carefully packing his worn supplies into a faded, threadbare backpack. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though he was trying to avoid being noticed. Charlotte approached him with a warm smile. "Brian," she said gently, "I saw your drawings during recess. You're very talented. Would you like to share them with the class one day?" Brian's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. But just as quickly he shook his head, declining the offer without a word. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and quietly walked towards the door, leaving Charlotte standing there, her heart heavy with concern. As the day drew to a close, Charlotte found herself watching the children file out of the classroom, their voices filling the air with the usual end-of-day excitement. Amidst the commotion, her eyes followed Brian, who moved more slowly than the others. He walked with his head down, his small figure seeming to shrink against the backdrop of the busy schoolyard. Charlotte's attention sharpened as she saw an older man approach him near the school gate. The man's appearance mirrored Brian's simple clothes, worn with age. He placed a hand on Brian's shoulder, guiding him toward a battered old car parked nearby. Charlotte watched as they climbed into the car and drove away, a knot of uncertainty forming in her stomach. Was that Brian's father? A relative? The questions lingered in her mind as she stood there, her gaze fixed on the distant road long after the car had disappeared from view. When she arrived home, the familiar scent of something delicious greeted her. Jason, her ever-thoughtful husband, was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of what smelled like a savory masterpiece. He looked up with a warm smile as she entered. "Hey, love, how was your day?" Charlotte slid onto the kitchen counter, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her as she began to share the day's events. "It was fine," she started, then paused. "But there's a new student in my class, Jason. His name is Brian, and he just seems so alone. His clothes are worn, and his school supplies are falling apart. Today, he didn't even have a proper notebook for the lesson." Jason's expression softened with concern as he continued stirring the pot. "That's heartbreaking," he said, his voice laced with sympathy. "It's tough to think that a child doesn't have the basics to succeed in school. Do you know anything about his family?" Charlotte shook her head slowly, recalling the image of Brian and the older man. "Not much. I saw someone pick him up today, an older man. He looked like he could be Brian's father, or maybe an uncle. They drove away in this really old car. It just made me wonder about his situation, you know." Jason nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "He sounds like he's going through a lot. You did the right thing by giving him that notebook. Even small gestures like that can mean the world to a kid who's struggling." A soft smile tugged at Charlotte's lips as she remembered the brief spark of light in Brian's eyes when she handed him the new notebook. You should have seen his face, Jason. For a moment, it was like he wasn't so burdened by everything. It just made me want to do more for him. Jason reached out and gently touched her hand, offering her a reassuring smile. "You're making a difference, Charlotte. Even if it's just one small step at a time, you're helping him more than you know." Charlotte nodded, her heart warmed by Jason's words. Yet, as she sat there, the image of Brian's quiet, withdrawn figure lingered in her mind. She knew she couldn't change everything for him overnight, but she was determined to do whatever she could to make him feel seen, valued, and supported no matter how long it took. Jason gently placed a comforting hand on Charlotte's shoulder, his eyes filled with understanding. "You always go above and beyond for your students, Charlotte. Give it time, Brian will open up to you eventually." His words provided her with a moment of solace, but they also strengthened her resolve. Charlotte knew that as a teacher, she wasn't just responsible for her students' education, she played an essential role in their emotional and personal growth as well. Brian was no exception, and she was determined to help him, no matter what it took. The following morning, Charlotte arrived at school earlier than usual, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She watched as the children trickled in, their backpacks bouncing as they ran towards the classroom. But her gaze searched specifically for one child. When Brian finally appeared, her heart sank. His clothes were even more disheveled than the day before, and his nails were caked with dirt. A wave of concern washed over her. What kind of conditions was this little boy living in? As the day progressed, Charlotte kept a close eye on Brian, her worry growing with each passing moment. During recess, she observed the children eagerly grabbing their snacks, laughing and comparing what they had brought. But Brian, sitting quietly on the edge of the playground, pulled out a crumpled piece of bread from his faded backpack. It was a stark contrast to the vibrant, healthy lunches the other children were enjoying, and Charlotte's heart ached at the sight. She suddenly remembered the sandwich Jason had lovingly prepared for her that morning. Without a second thought, she reached into her bag and pulled it out. Approaching Brian with a gentle smile, she knelt down beside him. "Brian," she said softly, "I brought an extra sandwich today. Would you like to try it?" Brian glanced at the sandwich, then back at Charlotte, his expression filled with embarrassment and hesitation. He shook his head, clearly reluctant to accept the offer. But Charlotte persisted, her voice warm and reassuring. "It's really tasty, I promise. I'm sure you'll like it." After a brief pause, Brian reluctantly took the sandwich from her hands. As he began to eat, Charlotte noticed how quickly he devoured it, the hunger evident in every bite. Her heart squeezed at the sight. How long had he been going without proper meals? Seizing the moment, Charlotte decided to gently probe into Brian's life, hoping to understand more about his situation. "Brian," she began softly, "the man who picks you up from school, is he your father?" Brian's eyes dropped to the ground, his small voice barely audible as he replied, "No, he's my uncle. I don't know who my father is." Charlotte's heart tightened at his response. There was so much pain and uncertainty hidden behind those few words, and it became clear to her that Brian's life was far more complicated than she had initially imagined. She sat down beside him, hoping to offer him even the smallest bit of comfort. "Brian," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you can talk to me whenever you want. I'm here to help, okay?" Brian didn't respond, but Charlotte could feel the weight of his silence. She knew that it would take time for him to trust her, to open up about whatever struggles he was facing. But she was determined to be there for him, to let him know that he wasn't alone. In that moment, she made a silent promise to herself. No matter what it took, she would find a way to support Brian, to make sure he felt safe, cared for, and seen. Brian just nodded in silence, leaving Charlotte with the unsettling realization that gaining his trust would be a gradual process. After watching him finish his sandwich, she knew she couldn't leave things as they were. Determined to act, Charlotte headed straight to Dr. Michael Brown's office, her heart heavy with concern. She knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside. The principal was at his desk, surrounded by paperwork, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose. He glanced up as she entered, giving her a brief nod. "Yes, Charlotte. What can I do for you?" he asked, sounding preoccupied. Taking a deep breath, Charlotte gathered her thoughts, knowing she needed to approach this carefully. "It's about Brian, our new student," she began, her voice steady but laced with worry. "I've noticed a few things that concern me. He's always wearing dirty clothes, and today I saw that he only had a piece of bread for lunch. I'm worried about him." Dr. Michael Brown sighed, removing his glasses and rubbing his temples as though her words were a burden. "Charlotte, when his uncle registered him, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The man seemed fine, didn't mention any issues. I don't see any reason for alarm." Charlotte pressed on, refusing to let his dismissive tone deter her. "But doesn't it seem strange? His appearance, his lack of proper food. These are signs that something might be wrong at home." The principal's patience was visibly wearing thin. He shook his head, waving off her concerns. "Charlotte, you're overreacting. These are personal matters that go beyond our responsibility. You're here to teach, not meddle in students' lives." A surge of frustration rose within Charlotte. She had always known Dr. Michael Brown to be more concerned with paperwork than the well-being of his students, but his blatant indifference caught her off guard. She tried to keep her voice calm and composed. "Dr. Brown, as teachers, it's part of our duty to look after our students' overall well-being. If a child isn't healthy, it affects their ability to learn and grow." Dr. Michael Brown raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his expression exasperated. "Look, Charlotte, do your job. If there's a real issue, we'll address it when it arises. For now, I have a mountain of paperwork to get through." Feeling a wave of disappointment wash over her, Charlotte left the office, her heart heavy with a sense of helplessness. She had hoped for a more compassionate response, but she wasn't surprised. Dr. Michael Brown had a reputation for being disconnected from the real issues his students faced. Back in the classroom, Charlotte tried to focus on her work, but thoughts of Brian lingered at the forefront of her mind. She couldn't shake the image of his sad, withdrawn face. Despite the principal's dismissal, she knew she couldn't simply turn a blind eye. She was determined to dig deeper, to understand more about Brian's situation, even if it meant going against the administration's indifference. Later that day, during recess, Charlotte kept a watchful eye on the playground. The children were running around, laughing and playing, but Brian was, once again, off to the side, isolated from the others. She watched him closely, her concern growing by the minute. Then, something caught her attention. One of the other boys, a known troublemaker, was approaching Brian with a mischievous grin on his face. Charlotte tensed as she watched the boy taunt Brian, cruelly calling him a poor and smelly boy. Brian's face flushed with hurt, and for a brief moment, it looked as though he was about to lash out in retaliation. But before he could react, Charlotte quickly intervened, stepping in and gently placing a hand on Brian's arm. Her eyes were stern as she turned to the provoking boy. "That behavior is unacceptable," she said firmly, her voice steady and calm but filled with authority. "Go to the office now and wait there. We'll talk about your behavior later." The boy's smirk faded, replaced by a look of guilt and embarrassment as he shuffled off towards the principal's office. Charlotte turned her attention back to Brian, who was still visibly shaken by the encounter. She knelt down beside him, offering a reassuring smile. "Are you okay, Brian?" she asked softly. Brian nodded but remained silent, his eyes downcast. Charlotte could see the emotional toll the teasing had taken on him, and it only deepened her resolve to help him. She gently squeezed his shoulder, hoping to convey that he wasn't alone in this. "Remember, Brian, you can always come to me if something's bothering you. I'm here for you, okay?" Brian looked up at her for a brief moment, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions: gratitude, sadness, and uncertainty. He didn't say anything, but Charlotte knew that, in his own way, he was beginning to trust her, little by little. And that was enough for now. The boy, clearly recognizing that he had crossed a line, darted off toward the principal's office without further protest. Charlotte turned her full attention to Brian, who stood there, his small frame trembling as he tried to hold back tears. The cruel words had clearly left their mark on him, and Charlotte's heart ached at the sight of his silent suffering. "Brian," she said softly, kneeling down to meet his eye level, "please don't listen to what he said. You are a very special boy, and you didn't deserve any of those hurtful words." Her voice was tender, filled with the warmth she hoped would ease the pain he was feeling. Brian kept his gaze fixed on the ground, but his tears fell silently, betraying the emotional storm within him. Charlotte knew she had to do something more, something to lift his spirits, even just for a little while. An idea sparked in her mind. "How about we take a break and go for some ice cream? Just the two of us," she suggested, her tone light and encouraging, hoping to bring a bit of joy into his day. Brian looked up at her, surprised by the offer. He hesitated, glancing around uncertainly. "But what about class?" he asked in a small voice, his shyness still evident. "Don't worry," Charlotte reassured him with a gentle smile. "I'll ask another teacher who's already free to cover my class for the rest of the day. Today is a special day for you." She could see the conflict in his eyes, but after a little more gentle persuasion, Brian finally nodded, still a bit unsure but willing to trust her. With that, Charlotte led Brian to a nearby ice cream shop. It was a small, cozy place with a colorful display of flavors that immediately caught Brian's attention. His eyes widened as he took in the vibrant options, clearly impressed by the array of choices before him. "Go ahead, Brian. Choose any flavor you want," Charlotte encouraged, watching as he scanned the options. After a few moments, he shyly pointed to the chocolate ice cream. She ordered it for him, along with a scoop for herself, and they settled into a booth by the window. At first, Brian ate his ice cream slowly, his usual hesitation still present. But as he continued, Charlotte noticed a transformation. A small, genuine smile began to form on his face. It was subtle, but it was there, and it warmed her heart to see him enjoying something so simple. It was the first time she had seen him smile since he joined her class, and that small smile felt like a significant breakthrough. After finishing their ice cream, Charlotte and Brian made their way back to school, the atmosphere between them noticeably lighter. However, as soon as they arrived, they were met by Dr. Michael Brown, who was clearly waiting for them with a stern expression. "Charlotte, this is completely unacceptable," he began, his tone sharp with disapproval. "Why did you leave the school with Brian during class hours?" Charlotte felt a pang of apprehension but stood her ground. She explained the situation calmly, hoping the principal would understand. Dr. Michael Brown, after the incident at recess, Brian was very upset. "I just wanted to help him feel better, so I took him for some ice cream. We didn't go far, and we were back within a reasonable time." But Dr. Michael Brown remained unmoved, his expression stern. "That's no justification, Charlotte. What if his uncle had come to pick him up and found him missing? You put yourself and the school at risk by leaving without notifying anyone." Charlotte tried to reason with him, her voice steady but urgent. "I knew the schedule, Dr. Brown. I was certain there wouldn't be any problems. I just wanted to help Brian through a difficult moment." The principal, however, wasn't swayed by her explanation. He shook his head, still dissatisfied. "Don't do this again, Charlotte. It could cause serious issues in the future. And just so you know, Brian's uncle is on his way to pick him up. I've already called him to inform him of what happened." Charlotte's heart sank slightly at the principal's words. She had only wanted to help Brian, but now it seemed like her actions had stirred up more trouble than she had anticipated. She nodded, acknowledging Dr. Brown's warning, but in her heart, she knew she wouldn't stop caring for her students. Despite the principal's rigid stance, Charlotte remained resolute. She would continue to look out for Brian and any other child who needed her, no matter the obstacles. Hearing that Brian's uncle was on his way, Charlotte decided to stay and speak with him. She felt an urgent need to better understand the boy's circumstances and see if there was anything else she could do to help. While she waited, she kept an eye on Brian, who seemed a bit more relaxed after their brief ice cream outing. The tension in his shoulders had eased slightly, and for a moment she saw a glimpse of the child he could be if life hadn't been so hard on him. When Brian's uncle arrived, his demeanor was calm but distant. There was a subtle coldness in his eyes as he approached, and Brian immediately gravitated towards him, his head down, as if he were trying to make himself invisible. The uncle's gaze locked on Charlotte, his voice serious as he asked, "What happened here?" "The principal called me with some troubling news." Charlotte took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. She wanted to explain the situation without escalating things further. There was an incident during recess. Another student provoked Brian, calling him names. I stepped in before things could get worse. Brian was about to defend himself, but I managed to calm him down. The uncle's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Brian doesn't usually react like that," he said, his tone a mix of concern and confusion. "He's a quiet boy. I'm not sure why he would lash out." Seeing an opportunity to learn more, Charlotte decided to address another issue that had been weighing on her mind. She softened her voice, careful not to come across as judgmental. "I've noticed that sometimes Brian comes to school with his clothes and nails a bit dirty. I just wanted to check if everything is okay at home, and if there's anything we can do to support him." The uncle seemed uncomfortable but not defensive. He shifted his weight, avoiding her gaze for a moment before responding. "I'll try to keep a better eye on that. Things can get a bit hectic at home, and sometimes things slip through the cracks." Charlotte sensed that the man was not entirely forthcoming, but she appreciated that he wasn't outright dismissive either. Hoping to bring up another important point, she added, "Brian also struggles to complete his homework. It's affecting his learning, and I think it's important that we find a way to help him stay on track." The uncle glanced at Brian, who still hadn't lifted his eyes from the ground. There was a pause before he responded, his voice a bit softer. "I didn't realize that. I'll start checking his notebooks more often. Thank you for letting me know." Feeling like she had opened a small window of communication, Charlotte decided to take a step further. "Would it be all right if I had your phone number, just in case I need to reach out about Brian or discuss anything that might come up?" The uncle hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing the implications. After a moment, he nodded, pulling out a piece of paper and scribbling down his number. "All right, you can call if there's anything important," he said, handing her the slip of paper. "Thank you," Charlotte replied sincerely, taking the paper and tucking it into her pocket. She watched as Brian and his uncle walked away, the older man's hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. Despite his initial reluctance, she felt like she had made some progress, if only a small step toward understanding the complexities of Brian's life. Back at home, the familiar warmth of the kitchen greeted her, and she found Jason busy at the stove preparing dinner. He glanced over as she entered, noticing the thoughtful look on her face. "Hey, you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "You seem a bit worried." Charlotte sighed, sitting down at the table, her mind still turning over the day's events. "I spoke with Brian's uncle today," she began, her voice tinged with both frustration and concern. "He's very reserved, didn't share much about their situation. And Brian, he barely looked up when his uncle arrived. It's like he's afraid to be seen, and that really worries me." Jason turned down the heat on the stove, giving her his full attention. "Did you manage to get any useful information? Anything that might help you understand what's going on with Brian?" Charlotte shook her head, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. "Not much, really, but I did get his uncle's phone number. It's something, at least. I'll keep an eye on Brian in the coming days and see if I can find out more." Jason nodded thoughtfully, his eyes filled with empathy. "You're doing everything you can, Charlotte. It's tough when you can't get all the answers right away, but I know you'll figure out the best way to help him." Charlotte smiled softly, feeling reassured by Jason's words. But deep down, the worry remained. Brian's situation felt more complicated than she had anticipated, and she knew it would take time and patience to fully understand what was going on in his life. But no matter how long it took, she was committed to being there for him, to making sure he didn't have to face his challenges alone. Jason, ever the supportive partner, placed his hand gently on Charlotte's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, Charlotte," he reassured her, his voice calm and steady. "Keeping an eye on him is important. Maybe with time, he'll start to trust you more and open up." After a moment of thoughtful silence, Jason added, "What if we bought some clothes for Brian? It might help him feel a bit more comfortable at school. A fresh start, even if it's just an appearance, could make a difference for him." Charlotte looked at Jason, her eyes widening with surprise and gratitude. His suggestion touched her deeply. "Would you really do that? It would mean so much to him. He always comes to school in the same clothes, and I'm sure it would boost his confidence if he could arrive looking and feeling cleaner." Jason smiled warmly, his heart clearly in the right place. "Of course, Charlotte. Don't worry about the cost. I'll take care of it. Anything to help Brian feel more comfortable." Charlotte's eyes softened with emotion. "You have such a big heart, Jason. Thank you. This means the world to me and to Brian, even if he doesn't say it." The following morning, Charlotte arrived at school earlier than usual, carrying a bag filled with new clothes Jason had helped her pick out for Brian. She stood near the entrance, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and anxiety as she waited for Brian to arrive. When she finally saw him walking toward the school, she discreetly called him over. "Brian," she said gently, handing him the bag, "I brought something for you." Brian hesitated before opening the bag, but when he saw the new clothes inside, his eyes lit up with surprise and gratitude. However, his excitement quickly faded, and his expression turned to one of concern. The shift was immediate, and Charlotte's heart sank. "Brian, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Brian looked around nervously, his voice barely above a whisper, as he replied, "My uncle. He told me not to accept things from other people, and he said I shouldn't talk about our life." A chill ran down Charlotte's spine at his words. Why would his uncle discourage Brian from accepting help or speaking about his life? Something felt off. "That's strange, Brian," she said, trying to remain calm while processing this new information. "Why would he say that?" Brian shrugged, clearly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact as he mumbled, "I don't know." Charlotte's mind raced. She thought back to her conversation with Brian's uncle the day before. Had she triggered this reaction by asking too many questions? Even after speaking with the uncle, Brian's appearance hadn't improved much. His hair was still disheveled, and while his nails were somewhat cleaner, they still bore signs of neglect. Charlotte's concern deepened as she began to piece together the signs that something wasn't right at home. Later in the day, her unease grew even stronger when she noticed Brian's homework. The handwriting in his notebook was neat, far neater than she knew Brian's writing to be. The realization struck her like a brick. This wasn't his work. After class, Charlotte gently pulled Brian aside. "Brian, who did your homework?" she asked, showing him the notebook. "This handwriting doesn't look like yours." Brian's face turned pale, and he lowered his head, mumbling something too quiet to make out. Charlotte's heart ached for him. He was clearly hiding something, but whatever it was too heavy for him to bear alone. "Brian," she said softly but firmly, "you can trust me. If something is going on, I'm here to help. I want to help." But Brian remained silent, refusing to meet her eyes. His lips pressed into a thin line, and Charlotte could see the fear and uncertainty that weighed on him. Frustration and worry gnawed at her as she realized she had hit another wall. Despite all her efforts, she couldn't break through to him, at least not yet. Charlotte felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier on her shoulders. She knew she needed to tread carefully, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Brian's situation was more serious than anyone realized. Charlotte's heart was still racing from her risky decision to search through the principal's office when she took the phone from Dr. Michael Brown. The situation was already tense, and now she found herself caught off guard by the unexpected call from Brian's uncle. "Teacher Charlotte, it's me," Ronald came the slightly panicked voice on the other end of the line. "I have a problem here. My car broke down, and I'm stuck in the neighboring town. I can't pick up Brian today. Could you?" Charlotte paused for a moment, her mind racing as she processed the situation. She knew she was walking a fine line with Brian's uncle, especially after their last conversation, but this was an opportunity to ensure Brian was taken care of. She couldn't ignore a request for help, especially when it concerned the boy she was so worried about. "Of course, Ronald," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring. "I can look after Brian until you get things sorted. How long do you think you'll be?" There was a brief hesitation on the other end before Ronald responded, "I'm not sure. It could take a few hours to get the car fixed, maybe even until tomorrow. If it's okay with you, could you keep Brian with you until I can make it back?" Charlotte's mind raced as she considered her options. She couldn't very well leave Brian alone, and this might be the opportunity she needed to connect with him on a deeper level, to understand more about his situation. "Don't worry, Ronald," she said, deciding to take the chance. "I'll take Brian home with me for the evening. We'll make sure he's safe and comfortable until you can come and get him." There was a sigh of relief from Ronald on the other end of the line. "Thank you, Charlotte. I appreciate it. I'll call you as soon as I know more." After hanging up, Charlotte turned to Dr. Michael Brown, who was still eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Brian's uncle is having car trouble," she explained quickly. "I'm going to take Brian home with me until he can pick him up." The principal frowned but nodded slowly. "All right, Charlotte. Just be sure to keep the school updated on the situation. And be careful." Charlotte thanked him and hurried back to her classroom, where Brian was sitting quietly at his desk, unaware of the unfolding situation. She approached him gently, kneeling beside him. "Brian," she began softly, "your uncle called. He's having some car trouble, so I'm going to take you home with me for a little while. Okay?" Brian looked at her with wide eyes, clearly surprised by the news. "Really?" he asked hesitantly, as though he wasn't sure what to make of the idea. "Yes," Charlotte said with a reassuring smile. "We'll go to my house, and you can have dinner with me and Mr. Jason. We'll take good care of you until your uncle can come get you." Brian seemed to relax slightly at the mention of her husband, and after a moment he nodded. "Okay," he whispered, his voice soft but trusting. As they left the school together, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a mixture of hope and anxiety. She knew she was stepping into unknown territory, but she also felt that this was an important step in helping Brian. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was determined to be there for him, to make sure he knew he wasn't alone. Before Ronald could finish explaining, Charlotte instinctively interrupted, "Of course, I can take Brian home, but are you all right?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Ronald responded with a deep sigh. "Yes, I'm fine, just stuck here for now. Oh, and please don't mention this to the principal or anyone at the school. It's better that way." A chill ran down Charlotte's spine at the odd request, but she quickly masked her concern. "All right, Ronald, I'll take care of it," she replied, keeping her voice steady. As she hung up, she noticed Dr. Michael Brown standing nearby, watching her with a curious expression. "Was that about Brian?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of suspicion. Charlotte, still processing Ronald's strange request, responded swiftly, trying to sound casual. "Yes, it was his uncle. He was asking about Brian's grades," she lied smoothly, hoping the principal wouldn't press the matter further. Satisfied with her answer, Dr. Brown nodded and walked away. Charlotte let out a quiet breath of relief, grateful that he hadn't probed any deeper. But the conversation with Ronald lingered in her mind, unsettling her as she made her way back to her classroom. At the end of the school day, Charlotte approached Brian, who had been sitting quietly at his desk, anxiously waiting for some news. She crouched down beside him and spoke gently. "Brian, your uncle had a problem and can't pick you up today. So, I'm going to take you to my house, and you can stay with us tonight. Tomorrow I'll bring you back to school, and your uncle will pick you up at the end of the day," she explained, doing her best to reassure him. Brian's face tightened with worry, and he quickly responded, "No, teacher. My uncle told me I can't go with other people." Charlotte gave him a warm, understanding smile, hoping to ease his fear. "I know, Brian, but it's just for one night, and your uncle is okay with it. I promise it'll be all right. We'll take good care of you." After a moment of hesitation, Brian nodded reluctantly, though the anxiety was still evident in his eyes. Charlotte could feel the weight of his unease, but hoped that her sincerity would help him trust her. As they left the school, Charlotte pulled out her phone and sent a quick message to Jason. "Jason, Brian will be staying with us tonight. Can you prepare something nice for dinner? I think he'll appreciate it." When they arrived at home, Brian was visibly shy and unsure of how to act in the unfamiliar surroundings. Jason, ever the welcoming host, greeted them at the door with a broad smile. "Hello, Brian. Welcome. We're having a special dinner tonight just for you," he said warmly, trying to put the boy at ease. Brian looked at Jason and then at Charlotte, still clearly uncomfortable, but there was a hint of relief in his eyes. The warmth of the household seemed to be chipping away at his nerves. "Do you like roast chicken?" Jason asked cheerfully as he led them into the kitchen. Brian nodded timidly, and Jason's face lit up. "Great. I'll make my special roast chicken just for you." While Jason busied himself in the kitchen, Charlotte showed Brian to the guest room, where she had already set out the clean clothes she had picked up on the way home. "Here you go, Brian," she said kindly, handing him the clothes. "You can wear these tonight. I hope they're comfortable." Brian took the clothes, his hands trembling slightly as he looked up at her. "Thank you, teacher," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Charlotte smiled softly, feeling a mix of relief and concern. "You're welcome, Brian. If you need anything, just let me know, okay?" As Brian changed into the new clothes and settled in, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more beneath the surface, something she hadn't yet uncovered. But for tonight, her priority was to make him feel safe and cared for, to give him a small taste of comfort that he might not have at home. As the evening unfolded, the atmosphere in the house became lighter. Brian gradually began to relax, drawn in by Jason's warmth and Charlotte's quiet kindness. Little by little, the tension seemed to melt away, and by the time they all sat down to dinner, there was even a hint of a smile on Brian's face. For the first time since he had arrived at school, Charlotte felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps, with patience and care, they could make a difference in this boy's life. Brian, still visibly shy, thanked Charlotte in a soft whisper. After dinner, she led him to the guest room where he would sleep for the night. As he changed into the clean clothes, Charlotte noticed through the slightly ajar door just how thin he really was. His frame seemed fragile, and his old, worn-out shoes told a story of neglect. It broke her heart. "Brian, feel at home, okay? There's no reason to be afraid here," Charlotte said gently, trying her best to make him feel safe. Brian, now dressed in the clean clothes she had given him, looked up at her with wide, worried eyes. "My uncle. He won't like seeing me here. He'll be upset with me," he said, his voice trembling with fear. Charlotte felt a wave of protective instinct wash over her. She crouched down to his level, making sure her voice was soft and reassuring. "You're safe here, Brian. Nothing bad will happen. I promise," she said, though she could see that her words did little to soothe his anxiety. As she sat beside him, Charlotte decided to gently probe into what was going on at home. "Brian, can you tell me what happens at home? If something is bothering you, I can help. You don't have to go through this alone." But Brian shook his head quickly, as if the very thought of speaking about his home life terrified him. "I can't, teacher. I promised my uncle I wouldn't talk about it," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Then he added, "Can I go to sleep now?" Charlotte's heart tightened with concern, but she didn't want to push him further. "Of course, Brian," she said, offering him a gentle smile despite the worry gnawing at her. "I'll leave the door open. If you need anything, just call for me." She gently closed the door, leaving a small crack of light to comfort him, and then walked to the living room where Jason was waiting. She sat down heavily on the couch, her mind racing with all the troubling signs she had observed. "Jason," she began, her voice filled with concern, "something isn't right. There's something serious going on at Brian's uncle's house. He's terrified of talking about it, and I can't just stand by and do nothing." Jason, always her source of strength, looked at her with a calm but supportive gaze. "I know, Charlotte. You're right to be concerned, but you're not alone in this. We're in this together, and we'll figure out how to help him." His words were a small comfort, but Charlotte still felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She knew that whatever was happening in Brian's life wasn't something that could be fixed overnight, but she was determined to find a way to protect him. The next morning, Charlotte woke up before the sun had risen, driven by a combination of determination and anxiety. She went to the kitchen and began preparing breakfast, thinking of Brian and what she could do to make him feel more secure. She made sure to cook a hearty meal, something that would nourish both his body and his spirit. When everything was ready, she softly called out, "Brian, breakfast is ready." Jason joined them in the kitchen, doing his best to create a relaxed and welcoming atmosphere. As they sat down to eat, Jason tried to gently engage Brian in conversation, hoping to make him feel more at ease. "So Brian, tell me more about your family," Jason said casually, trying not to sound too intrusive. But Brian tensed up immediately. His shoulders hunched, and he avoided eye contact, his discomfort obvious. I can't talk about that," he replied hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte exchanged a glance with Jason, her heart sinking even further. The boy's fear was palpable, and it confirmed what she had feared all along: something was very wrong. And whatever it was, Brian had been conditioned to keep it hidden. "That's okay, Brian," Charlotte said softly, quickly shifting the subject to something lighter. "You don't have to talk about anything you're not comfortable with. We just want you to feel safe and enjoy your breakfast." Brian nodded, still quiet but visibly relieved that the conversation had moved on. They continued their meal in relative silence, but Charlotte's mind was far from quiet. She knew she needed to take action, to find a way to uncover the truth of what was happening in Brian's life. But for now, she focused on making him feel as safe and cared for as possible, even if just for this one morning. As Brian sat at the breakfast table, staring at the food in front of him, he timidly raised his gaze to Charlotte and Jason. "Can I take one of these breads home?" he asked quietly, almost as if he were afraid of the answer. I'm always hungry, and sometimes there isn't much food." Charlotte felt a painful squeeze in her heart at his words. She forced a smile to hide her concern and responded warmly, "Of course you can, Brian. I'll prepare a nice snack for you to take home with you." While Charlotte busied herself in the kitchen, wrapping up some food for Brian, she noticed him watching her intently. His gaze was filled with longing, and then, almost too quietly to hear, he murmured, "It must be really nice to have a family that takes care of you like this." The simple statement hit Charlotte and Jason like a ton of bricks. They exchanged a look filled with emotion, both deeply moved by the boy's quiet confession. Jason, trying to keep his voice steady, replied softly, "You know, Brian, families come in all different forms. The most important thing is that there are always people who care about you, no matter what." Charlotte nodded in agreement, her eyes gentle as she added, "And you will always have people who care about you, Brian. Always." Brian didn't respond, but there was a faint glimmer of something in his eyes, hope, perhaps, that hadn't been there before. As soon as they finished breakfast, Charlotte took Brian to school, her mind already racing ahead to the afternoon when she would have the chance to speak with his uncle, Ronald. She knew she needed to get some answers and better understand the boy's situation. The lingering questions were too serious to ignore. Throughout the day, Charlotte struggled to concentrate on her teaching. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Brian and the conversation that awaited her at the end of the school day. She found herself anxiously glancing out the window at every passing car, her heart quickening each time she thought Ronald might be arriving. As the afternoon wore on, her anxiety only grew. Outside, she noticed Brian playing by himself, looking even more withdrawn than usual. His small frame seemed weighed down by something invisible yet heavy. Sensing that something was wrong, Charlotte approached him gently. "Brian," she asked softly, kneeling beside him, "are you okay? You seem worried." Before Brian could answer, a car pulled up in front of the school, and Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. It was Ronald. He stepped out of the car and walked over to Brian, his expression calm but his movements hurried. He asked Brian briefly how his day had been, but before Charlotte could ask anything, Ronald turned to her and, in a tone so quick it almost masked his intentions, said, "Thanks for taking care of him, but I'm going to have to move Brian to another school." Charlotte froze. The words hit her like a slap in the face. She saw Brian's immediate reaction, his eyes widened in panic, and without a second thought, he ran to her, clinging to her with desperate strength. "Please, teacher," he sobbed, tears streaming down his face. "Don't let him take me. I don't want to go." Charlotte's heart constricted at the sight of Brian's desperation. She instinctively wrapped her arms around him, feeling his small body trembling against hers. Ronald seemed taken aback by Brian's reaction, his expression shifting to one of surprise and discomfort. He took a step toward them, but Charlotte quickly stood up, positioning herself protectively between Brian and his uncle. "Ronald," she said firmly, though her voice was calm, "what's going on? Why do you want to move Brian from school so suddenly?" Ronald hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an excuse. "It's nothing personal," he said, his tone defensive. "I just think it's best for him to be in a different environment. Maybe a fresh start will be good for him." Charlotte wasn't convinced. There was something more behind his words, something he wasn't telling her. She could feel Brian's grip tightening around her, and she knew she couldn't let this go without a fight. "Ronald," she began, choosing her words carefully, "Brian is doing well here. He's starting to settle in, and he's building connections. Moving him now would be disruptive, especially when he needs stability the most." Ronald's face hardened slightly, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I appreciate what you're saying, but it's not up for discussion. I have my reasons." Charlotte's mind raced, trying to think of how to respond. She knew she needed to tread carefully, but she also couldn't ignore the obvious fear in Brian's eyes. "If it's about something specific, maybe we can work together to address it. I just want to make sure that Brian's best interests are at the heart of whatever decision is made." Ronald looked at her, his gaze sharp, and for a moment it seemed like he might push back harder. But then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll think about it," he muttered, though it was clear he wasn't entirely convinced. "But this conversation isn't over. I have to do what I think is right for him." Charlotte nodded, knowing that she had at least bought some time, even if the situation was far from resolved. As Ronald led Brian to the car, the boy glanced back at her with tear-filled eyes, silently pleading for help. Charlotte's heart ached, but she gave him a reassuring nod, silently promising that she wouldn't give up on him. As the car drove away, Charlotte stood there for a moment, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her. She knew she had to find a way to protect Brian, to uncover the truth of what was happening behind closed doors. And no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, she was prepared to fight for him, for his safety, and for his chance at a better future. Brian's cries echoed in Charlotte's mind as she watched him being forcibly pulled into the car. The sight of his tear-streaked face pleading with her, "Please, don't take me. I want to stay here," sent a surge of anger and despair through her. She felt momentarily paralyzed, unable to comprehend what was happening. Ronald's cold demeanor and refusal to acknowledge Brian's desperate pleas only added to her growing fear. As Ronald got into the car and began driving away, Charlotte snapped out of her shock and ran toward them. "Wait, Brian," she shouted, her voice trembling with urgency. But it was too late. The car sped off, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't let it end like this. She had to do something. Driven by instinct and concern, Charlotte sprinted to her own car, barely pausing to think. She knew she had to follow Ronald, to find out where he was taking Brian, and why he was taking Brian, and why he was so insistent on removing him from school so suddenly. Her mind raced with questions and fear. What was this man hiding? Why was Brian so terrified? As she pulled onto the road, she kept a safe distance behind Ronald's car, her eyes never leaving his taillights. Her heart was racing as fast as her thoughts. Should I call the police, she wondered, her hand hovering over her phone. But the uncertainty of the situation made her hesitate. What if involving the police made things worse for Brian? She decided to continue following him for now, determined to find out where they were going first. Ronald seemed to be driving recklessly, increasing his speed and making sharp, unpredictable turns. Charlotte had to focus hard to keep up without drawing too much attention to herself. The farther they drove, the more uneasy she became. The familiar streets of the city quickly gave way to more remote, isolated roads, and Charlotte's sense of dread deepened. Why is he heading this way? Where is he taking Brian? She thought, anxiety gnawing at her insides. At a red light, she seized the brief moment of calm to grab her phone and call Jason. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Jason, I'm following Brian's uncle. He's driving really fast, and we're getting farther and farther away from the city." Jason's response was immediate, his voice filled with concern. "Charlotte, this is really dangerous. You need to come back. We don't know what this man is capable of. Please, think this through." Charlotte's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she watched Ronald's car pull ahead. "I know, Jason," she replied, her voice strained. "But I can't just leave Brian. Something feels very wrong. I need to see where he's taking him. I need to know that Brian will be okay." Jason hesitated on the other end of the line, clearly torn between his worry for Charlotte's safety and understanding her determination. "Please be careful, Charlotte. Keep your distance and don't take any unnecessary risks. If things start to look dangerous, promise me you'll call the police." "I will," she assured him, though the tension in her chest made it hard to feel certain about anything. She ended the call, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The landscape grew more desolate as Ronald's car continued down increasingly remote roads. Trees lined the sides of the narrow road, and there were fewer signs of life with each passing mile. Charlotte's heart raced faster, her mind spinning with possibilities, none of them good. She kept a safe distance, but could feel the urgency building inside her. She couldn't lose them now. "What are you hiding, Ronald?" she wondered. "Why are you so desperate to take Brian away from everyone?" As they drove deeper into the rural area, Charlotte's gut instinct told her that something terrible was about to happen. She prayed silently that she would be able to find a way to protect Brian, to uncover the truth before it was too late. With every mile, her resolve only strengthened. She wouldn't stop until she knew the boy was safe. The road stretched on, and Charlotte gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Hold on, Brian," she thought, a silent promise echoing in her mind. I won't let you go through this alone." Charlotte's heart raced as she stood outside the ramshackle shack, hidden among the tall weeds and shadows. The scene inside was both heartbreaking and disturbing. Brian, sitting on the filthy mattress, was a picture of fear and desperation, while Ronald, with his cold demeanor, seemed completely indifferent to the boy's pleas. Charlotte's instincts screamed at her to act, but she knew she had to be smart. Charging in recklessly would only make things worse for both her and Brian. As she recorded the scene through the small, grimy window, every second felt like an eternity. Brian's sobs filled the air, and Charlotte's heart ached as she listened to him plead with his uncle. The boy's words cut deep. "Please, Uncle, don't take me away from my school. I like it there. I like my teacher." Ronald's response was harsh and dismissive, his impatience evident in his voice. "It's already decided, Brian. Now, enough talk." Charlotte fought back the urge to burst in and confront Ronald right then and there. She knew she needed concrete evidence to protect Brian in the long run. Her phone's camera was shaky, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. But she continued filming, capturing every chilling detail. Just as she was about to retreat and call for help, her foot brushed against something in the tall grass, a plastic bottle. The sharp crinkle of the plastic shattered the eerie silence, and Charlotte's blood ran cold. She froze, her heart pounding wildly in her chest, praying that the sound hadn't drawn Ronald's attention. For a brief, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then she heard Ronald's voice from inside the shack. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his tone suddenly sharp, filled with suspicion. Charlotte held her breath, crouching lower to the ground, willing herself to disappear into the darkness. She could hear the shuffling of feet inside the shack as Ronald moved toward the door. Panic surged through her veins. "I can't get caught." "Not now," she thought desperately. The door creaked open, and Charlotte ducked behind a stack of old, rusted barrels, barely out of sight. She watched as Ronald stepped out, his eyes scanning the area. His expression was tense, and he seemed to be on high alert. Charlotte pressed herself closer to the barrels, every muscle in her body taut with tension. Ronald took a few steps forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the perimeter. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sharp and demanding. Charlotte's mind raced. She knew she couldn't afford to be found, but she also couldn't leave Brian behind. She held her breath, staying as still as possible, hoping that the growing darkness would be enough to keep her hidden. After what felt like an eternity, Ronald seemed to decide that the noise had been nothing more than an animal or the wind. He grunted in irritation and turned back toward the shack, his footsteps heavy on the dirt path. Charlotte allowed herself to exhale slowly, her pulse still racing in her ears. She waited until Ronald had fully re-entered the shack before making her next move. With trembling hands, she ended the recording on her phone and quickly sent the video to Jason as a backup. She then texted him her location, urgently explaining what she had witnessed and asking him to contact the authorities. As she crept away from the shack, her mind was already spinning with the next steps. She couldn't confront Ronald alone, it was too dangerous. But now, with evidence in hand, she knew she had a real chance to protect Brian. She just needed to buy some time until help arrived. Moving as quickly and quietly as possible, Charlotte retreated to her car, every nerve on edge. Once inside, she locked the doors and took a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. She picked up her phone and dialed Jason again, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Jason, I got the video. I'm sending it to you. I need you to call the police. There's no time to waste." Jason's voice was filled with urgency. "Charlotte, get out of there now. I'm calling the police, but you need to stay safe." "I will," Charlotte promised, though her mind was still on Brian. She couldn't leave without knowing he would be okay. But for now, she knew she had to play it smart. With one last glance at the shack in the distance, she started her car and drove to a nearby location where she could wait for the police. As she drove, her thoughts were consumed with worry for Brian. She silently vowed that no matter what it took, she would protect him from whatever horrors awaited him in that shack. "Hang on, Brian," she thought, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Help is on the way." Charlotte stood just inside the door of the shack, her senses overwhelmed by the stale air and the general disarray of the place. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of information she had about Brian's situation. She glanced at Ronald, whose demeanor had shifted from defensive to resigned, and then at Brian, who clung to her side with wide, fearful eyes. When Ronald invited her to step inside and talk, Charlotte hesitated for a moment. She knew the risk she was taking, but she also knew that understanding the full picture was the only way she could truly help Brian. She gave the boy a reassuring squeeze, silently promising him that she wasn't going to abandon him. Then she followed Ronald into the dimly lit shack. The interior of the shack reflected the chaos and neglect that Ronald's life seemed to embody. There were piles of plastic bottles scattered across the floor, and an unpleasant odor hung in the air, making it hard for Charlotte to breathe deeply. Ronald gestured for her to sit down, but she remained standing, unwilling to let her guard down just yet. "Brian, go play inside, please," Ronald said gently, motioning toward the small room that appeared to be the only semi-clean space in the entire shack. Brian hesitated for a moment, looking up at Charlotte for reassurance. She nodded encouragingly, and with some reluctance, Brian obeyed, retreating into the room and closing the door behind him. Once they were alone, Ronald leaned against the wall, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He seemed to be struggling to find the right words. "It's a long story," he finally began, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Brian's mother, my sister, passed away last year. She was raising Brian on her own, fighting a losing battle against a severe illness. She didn't have anyone else, except me." Charlotte listened quietly, her heart softening as Ronald spoke. She could sense the pain in his voice, the weight of responsibility that had fallen on him after his sister's death. But she also knew there had to be more to the story, something that explained Brian's fear and Ronald's secrecy. "She was a good person," Ronald continued, his eyes distant as if recalling memories from a different life. "But she made a terrible mistake when she got involved with Brian's father. He's a bad man, a dangerous man. I told her to stay away from him, but she didn't listen. By the time she realized what kind of person he really was, it was too late." Charlotte's mind raced with questions. She had a vague idea of what Ronald was implying, but she needed more details to fully grasp the situation. "Where is Brian's father now?" she asked cautiously. Ronald's expression darkened. "He's been in and out of trouble with the law for years. I don't know where he is right now, but I do know that if he ever finds out about Brian, he'll come for him. And if that happens," Ronald's voice trailed off, his face contorted with worry. Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine. The danger wasn't just in the neglect she had seen, it was in the looming threat of someone far more dangerous. She tried to remain calm, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "Ronald, I understand that you're trying to protect Brian," she said carefully, "but isolating him and keeping him out of school isn't the way to do it. He needs stability, care, and the opportunity to thrive." Ronald sighed heavily, rubbing his face with his hands. "You think I don't know that?" he muttered, his voice filled with frustration. "But it's not that simple. I'm not equipped to raise him the way he deserves. I'm trying, but I'm barely keeping it together myself. And if his father ever tracks us down, I just don't know what to do." Charlotte's heart ached for both Ronald and Brian. She could see that Ronald was a man caught between fear and obligation, trying to do his best in an impossible situation. But she also knew that something had to change. Brian couldn't continue living in these conditions, under constant fear. "You don't have to do this alone," she said gently. "There are resources available, people who can help. I can help you find them. But we need to work together to make sure Brian gets the care and protection he needs. Keeping him isolated like this isn't the solution, it's only hurting him more." Ronald looked at her with a mix of skepticism and desperation. "Do you really think anyone can help us?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with hopelessness. Charlotte nodded firmly. "Yes, I do. But the first step is letting go of the fear and accepting that it's okay to ask for help. You're not a bad person, Ronald. I can see that you care about Brian. But this situation, it can't go on like this. We have to find a way forward together." There was a long silence as Ronald considered her words. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "All right," he said softly, "but I need time to figure out what's next. I'm scared, Charlotte. I'm scared for him." Charlotte placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "We'll figure it out. You're not alone in this. We'll do what's best for Brian, together." As she left the shack, Charlotte knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that she had made progress. Ronald was willing to talk, willing to consider help. And that was the first step toward making sure that Brian was safe and cared for. She would make sure that Brian's future didn't have to be defined by fear. Ronald's words hung heavily in the air as Charlotte listened, her heart aching for the pain and fear that had shaped his decisions. It was clear that Ronald had been doing what he thought was best to protect Brian, but the weight of that responsibility had driven him into deeper isolation and fear. "My sister's relationship with Brian's father was always troubled, full of issues," Ronald began, his voice wavering as he relived each painful memory. "It got worse and worse, until she finally decided to separate from him. That's when she found out she was pregnant with Brian." He paused, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if searching for the right words. "After Brian was born, my former brother-in-law started stalking her. He was relentless, dangerous. My sister did everything she could to protect Brian, to keep him away from the truth about his father. She never told Brian who his father was. She didn't want him to carry that burden. But she was poor, and so am I. Only with me, it's worse. I've got no education, no stable job. I live off collecting trash. Which is why you see all these bottles around here." He gestured to the cluttered shack, his voice thick with emotion. "When my sister passed away, there was no one left but me to take care of Brian. I knew I had to protect him. I may not have much, but I wasn't going to let that man take him." Ronald's voice faltered, the weight of his fear and desperation evident in every word. "When Brian's father found out she had died, he decided he wanted the boy for himself. I don't know why, maybe out of spite, maybe to hurt Brian the way he hurt his mother. But I couldn't let that happen. So I took Brian and ran. We've been hiding ever since." Charlotte felt a knot form in her stomach as Ronald explained how he had taken Brian away from everything familiar to shield him from his father's reach. It was a heartbreaking situation, one born out of love but fueled by fear. "We used my sister's old car to escape," Ronald continued, looking directly at Charlotte now. His eyes were filled with a mix of fear and determination. "This shack, it's all I could find. It's remote, abandoned, and isolated. I thought if we could stay hidden here, we'd be safe. Everything I've done was to protect Brian." Charlotte could see the toll this life had taken on Ronald. He was a man doing his best in a situation that seemed impossible to navigate. But hiding Brian away like this, cutting him off from the world, wasn't a sustainable solution. "But why did you decide to take Brian out of school?" Charlotte asked, her voice filled with the confusion she still felt. "He was happy there. He was starting to form connections, and I know how much he values being in class." Ronald sighed deeply, the weight of his decision evident in his expression. "I know he was happy there," he admitted, his voice softer now. "But that's exactly what scared me. Living like this, hiding all the time. I'm constantly afraid of being discovered. I don't have legal custody of Brian. and I know how fragile our situation is. When I realized how attached he was becoming to you and the school, I panicked. I thought that if someone looked into his life too closely, they might start asking questions. Questions that could lead them to his father. And if that happens, I don't know what I'd do." Charlotte's heart went out to him. She could see the fear that drove him, the fear of losing Brian to a man who had already caused so much pain in their lives. But at the same time, she knew that this path wasn't sustainable. Brian needed more than just hiding. He needed stability, safety, and a chance to build a life without the constant shadow of fear looming over him. "Ronald," she said gently, choosing her words carefully, "I understand why you're scared. You've been through so much, and all you want is to protect Brian. But keeping him isolated like this, it's not the answer. He deserves a chance to live a normal life, to have friends, to learn, to grow. And you don't have to do this alone. There are people who can help you, who can help both of you. But we need to find a way to make this situation safer for Brian." Ronald looked at her with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. But how? How do I keep him safe and still let him live a normal life? I don't have the resources or the knowledge to fight this. "You don't have to fight it alone," Charlotte replied, her voice firm but kind. "There are legal resources, people who can help you secure custody, and ways to protect Brian from his father. But we have to take that first step. We need to get you the support you need so that you don't have to keep running." Ronald nodded slowly, his resistance softening as he realized that Charlotte was offering him a way out. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. "I've been running for so long. I don't know what else to do." Charlotte placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We'll figure it out together. You've done everything you can to protect Brian, but now it's time to find a better way. A way that doesn't involve living in fear." As Charlotte left the shack, she felt a small sense of relief. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but Ronald had opened the door to the possibility of change. And for Brian's sake, she would do everything in her power to make sure that change happened. Ronald's words weighed heavily on Charlotte as she listened to him describe the sacrifices he had made for Brian. The man was clearly overwhelmed, doing everything he could to protect his nephew, even at the cost of his own well-being. The desperation in his voice, the worn-out mattress in the corner, and the meager life they were living, it was all too much for Charlotte to ignore. "I sent him to school, despite the risk, because I know how important it is for him to study, to have an education," Ronald continued, his voice trembling slightly. "But now, with the risk increasing, I don't know what to do." Charlotte's concern deepened, and she gently asked about Brian's basic needs. "And how is Brian's food, Ronald? Does he have enough to eat?" Ronald lowered his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Every day, while Brian is at school, I collect and sell recyclable materials. The money I make barely covers the basics. I buy food for Brian, but often I go without eating so he can have enough." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I managed to save up a little bit and bought him a semi-new mattress. It's not much, but it's better than what we had. I sleep on the old one." He pointed to the corner of the shack where a worn, threadbare mattress lay on the floor. Charlotte's heart broke for Ronald. He had been carrying this burden all on his own, sacrificing everything for Brian's safety and well-being. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll that this life had taken on him. "You've been doing all this alone?" she asked softly, her voice choked with emotion. Ronald looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "I would do anything to keep Brian safe and happy. He's all I have left." The depth of Ronald's love and dedication moved Charlotte deeply. She knew that, despite his flaws and the challenges he faced, he was doing his best to protect Brian in the only way he knew how. But she also knew that they couldn't go on like this. Brian needed more than just survival. He needed a chance at a real life, with support and stability. "Brian doesn't understand this whole situation," Ronald confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I asked him not to talk to anyone about our life to avoid being discovered, but he doesn't like living like this. He cries, asking to go to a better place. He wants to play, to be a normal kid. I try to do what I can, but I feel powerless for not being able to give him more." Charlotte felt a wave of empathy wash over her. This man, despite his fear and isolation, was trying his best. But they needed help, real help. "I'm going to help you," she said firmly, her mind already racing with ideas. She pulled out her phone and quickly called Jason, her voice urgent but controlled as she explained the situation in as few words as possible. "I'm sending you the location now," she added quickly. Jason, on the other end of the line, responded immediately. "Understood. My God, what a situation. I'm on my way. I'll call a lawyer friend and see what we can do." When Jason arrived at the shack, the gravity of the situation hit him immediately. He looked around, taking in the dilapidated state of the shack, the piles of plastic bottles, and the overall neglect. "This is unbelievable," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. He turned to Ronald with a kind but firm expression. "You can't stay here. Come to our house while we figure this out. I have a lawyer friend who can help sort out Brian's situation, and we'll work on getting you both to a safer place." Ronald hesitated, visibly torn between his gratitude for the offer and the fear that had kept him running for so long. I don't know," he said, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "This could bring problems for you too. What if Brian's father finds out? What if?" Jason cut him off gently, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll deal with that if it comes to it. But right now you both need a safe place to stay. We can't let you live like this anymore. We'll figure out the legal side, and we'll make sure that Brian is protected. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Ronald's eyes filled with tears, the weight of his fear and uncertainty threatening to overwhelm him. But there was also a glimmer of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He looked at Charlotte and Jason, both of whom had extended their hands to him, and Brian without hesitation. Slowly, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Okay, we'll come with you." Charlotte felt a wave of relief wash over her as she saw the decision in Ronald's eyes. This was just the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. Together, they would find a way to protect Brian and give him the future he deserved, a future free from fear and filled with hope. Ronald's eyes filled with emotion as he looked around Charlotte and Jason's warm, welcoming home. He had been living in survival mode for so long that this kindness felt almost unreal. But it was happening. He and Brian were safe, and they had a chance at a new beginning. The overwhelming sense of relief washed over him as he accepted their offer to stay with them. It was the first time in a long while that he allowed himself to believe that things might actually get better. At dinner that night, Brian seemed to relax for the first time since Charlotte had met him. The boy's usual fear and anxiety were replaced by quiet contentment as he sat at the table, eating a hearty meal in the comforting atmosphere of Charlotte and Jason's home. Ronald, too, seemed more at ease, though the weight of his past still lingered in his eyes. Over the next few days, Jason's lawyer friend worked tirelessly on their case. The investigation revealed the full extent of Brian's father's criminal activities. The man was a fugitive, wanted for several serious crimes, including theft, and had a history of violence. This information strengthened their case, and with Ronald's testimony about the abuse his sister had endured, the lawyer presented a compelling argument to the court. When the judge finally made the ruling, it was a moment of triumph. Ronald, who had been anxiously awaiting the decision, was at Charlotte and Jason's house when the news came in. The judge had granted Ronald legal custody of Brian, recognizing him as the only close relative who had shown genuine care for the boy's well-being. The ruling was a huge victory, a step toward a stable and secure future for both Ronald and Brian. Tears streamed down Ronald's face as he received the news. He could hardly believe that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved my nephew's life, and mine." Just as they were celebrating the good news, the phone rang again. It was Jason's lawyer friend with another update. Brian's father had been arrested that morning in a police operation. The man who had been the source of so much fear and pain was now in custody, and Ronald's nightmare of being hunted down by him was over. Jason shared the news with everyone, and Ronald could barely contain his disbelief. The man who had haunted their lives was finally behind bars, and for the first time in a long time, Ronald felt like he could breathe freely again. But the surprises weren't over yet. A few days later, Charlotte and Jason gathered with Ronald and Brian to give them one more gift, an envelope filled with money. Jason handed it over with a warm smile, explaining, "We were saving for our new house, but we think you need it more now. We've put half of our savings in here. This can help you start over, find a place to live, buy clothes and food. Money we can always recover." Ronald looked at the envelope, his hands trembling as he accepted it. The generosity of Charlotte and Jason was overwhelming. I don't know what to say," he stammered, tears filling his eyes once more. This is more than I could ever have imagined. Thank you." Charlotte smiled and added, "And there's one more thing. Jason has a waiter position at the restaurant where he works. It pays well, and he's willing to teach you everything you need to know." Ronald, still in shock, nodded, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. "I never imagined receiving so much help. How can I ever thank you?" Jason replied with a warm smile, "Just accept it, Ronald. You and Brian deserve a chance to start over, and we're happy to help. Seeing you both safe and happy is all the thanks we need." Ronald looked around at the people who had become more than just good Samaritans. They had become family. With their support, he knew that he and Brian could finally build the life they both deserved. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, safety, and a future that no longer felt out of reach. Brian's excitement overflowed as he dashed toward Charlotte and Jason, his small arms wrapping around them tightly in a warm, joyful embrace. His face lit up with pure happiness, and his voice trembled with excitement as he exclaimed, "I won't have to leave school. We're going to have a place to live, and I'll be able to play with my friends." The realization of what his future now held filled the room with an infectious energy that brought smiles to everyone's faces. Then, Brian turned to Ronald, his expression shifting to one of hopeful curiosity. "Uncle will be okay now, right?" he asked, his eyes wide with anticipation, seeking the reassurance that his uncle had always struggled to give. Ronald, overwhelmed by the emotions of the moment, knelt down to Brian's level and wrapped him in a tight hug. Tears streamed down Ronald's face, a mixture of relief and joy, emotions that had been buried under years of fear and uncertainty. His voice choked with emotion. Ronald managed to say, "Yes, Brian, we'll be okay now. Everything's going to be okay." The words, simple yet profound, felt like a promise, one that Ronald had fought so hard to fulfill. Brian pulled back slightly, looking up at Charlotte and Jason with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he began, his voice soft but filled with wisdom beyond his years, "I learned in school what a family is. And family isn't just about who you're born with. Family is where there's love and care. Thank you for being my family too." His words carried a weight that touched everyone deeply, as if the small boy had grasped the true essence of what they had all come to represent for one another. The room fell silent for a moment, as those simple, heartfelt words hung in the air. Charlotte and Jason, moved by the depth of Brian's understanding, felt their hearts swell with emotion. Without hesitation, they both stepped forward, wrapping their arms around Ronald and Brian, creating a circle of love and support. In that embrace, they all realized something profound, that family wasn't defined by blood alone. It was about the love, compassion, and kindness they had shared, the bonds that had formed through the struggles they had faced together. In that moment, they knew that they had become more than just people connected by circumstance. They had become a new kind of family. This family was forged in the fires of hardship and sustained by the unyielding love they had for one another. They were bound by a sense of gratitude, by the knowledge that they had made a difference in each other's lives, and by the hope that their future would be brighter because they had chosen to stand together. Now that you've experienced this emotional journey, what have you learned so far? How would you handle a situation where you knew something was wrong but weren't sure how to help? Comment below on one thing you've learned from this story and how you'll bring it into practice in your own life. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue to share these important stories.